On September 1st, 1939, the same morning that German tanks rolled across the Polish border, a 58-year-old brigadier general named George Catlett Marshall walked into the War Department building in Washington and took an oath that would change the course of history. He wore a white civilian suit that day, deliberately avoiding military dress so as not to appear eager for the war that had just begun in Europe. At 10:30 that morning, in Secretary of War Harry Woodring's office, Marshall was sworn in as Chief of Staff of the United States Army and promoted to the rank of full general. He had received word of the German invasion at 3:50 that morning. By the time he took his oath, Warsaw was already under bombardment. The army he inherited was a catastrophe waiting to happen. Fewer than 190,000 soldiers served in uniform. The force ranked somewhere around 19th in the world, smaller than the armies of Portugal, Switzerland, and Belgium. To put this in perspective, Germany had just invaded Poland with over 1,500,000 troops. The entire American army could have been swallowed by a single German army group with room to spare. Equipment dated to the previous war. Tanks were so scarce that soldiers trained with trucks bearing signs that read "tank." The army possessed fewer than 500 tanks total, most of them light models that would have been destroyed in minutes against German panzers. Artillery pieces were leftovers from 1918. Rifles were the same Springfield models that doughboys had carried into the trenches of France 2 decades earlier. The 9 infantry divisions that existed on paper were hollow shells. Only 3 divisions approached full strength. The other 6 averaged just 3,000 men, each instead of the 15,000 required for combat readiness. The 4 armies that administered the continental United States each had skeleton staffs of just 4,400 troops. No single American division possessed full operational capability. But Marshall understood that the crisis ran deeper than equipment, shortages, or manpower deficits. The real problem was leadership. The men who would have to command American soldiers in the coming war were too old, too set in their ways, and too comfortable in their positions to lead anyone into modern combat. Marshall looked at his general officers and saw what he later called considerable arteriosclerosis. The average age of generals was distressingly high. Many had been in their current positions for years, presiding over the same small commands, attending the same social functions, fighting the same bureaucratic battles they had fought for decades. Marshall knew that sentiment and tradition could not be allowed to stand in the way of national survival. Within 2 years, he would force out approximately 600 officers from the army. He would end careers, destroy friendships, and make enemies in Congress. He would be accused of gutting the army's brains, and he would create the generation of commanders who won the Second World War. The problem Marshall faced had been building for 2 decades. The promotion system in the peacetime army operated almost entirely through seniority. An officer could not advance until someone above him retired or died. Below the rank of brigadier general, there was essentially no other path upward. Merit counted for little. Initiative was often punished. The safest career strategy was to avoid mistakes, cultivate relationships with superiors, and wait. The result was a bottleneck that planners called the hump. Approximately 4,200 officers, nearly 1/3 of the entire regular Army officer corps, were clustered within an extraordinarily narrow age band. These men had entered the service during the First World War, received rapid wartime promotions during that conflict, and then watched their careers stagnate for the next 20 years. The numbers told a grim story. More than 1,800 captains were in their 40s. Over 1,000 officers whose age and experience qualified them for lieutenant colonel remained stuck as captains in 1940. 234 lieutenants were also in their 40s, men who had spent more than 2 decades at the most junior commissioned rank. The problem compounded itself. Young officers of talent looked at their seniors and saw no future. Many of the best left for civilian careers where ability was rewarded. Those who remained often became cynical, going through the motions of military service while waiting for retirement. The peacetime army was not attracting or retaining the talent it would need in war. Marshall understood this problem personally. He had been a colonel during the First World War, serving as Chief of Operations for the 1st Infantry Division and then as Chief of Staff for the 8th Corps and the 1st Army. His performance had been exceptional. General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, considered Marshall one of the most capable officers in the army. But after the armistice, Marshall was reduced in rank to captain. The wartime promotions evaporated. He served 15 more years before regaining the rank of colonel. The system that nearly derailed his own career was now his to reform. The generals who commanded the army in 1939 were products of this broken system. Most had reached their positions through patience rather than performance. They had waited their turn, avoided controversy, and outlasted their competitors. The qualities that made them successful in peacetime, caution, deference to superiors, mastery of bureaucratic procedure, were precisely the qualities that would get men killed in war. Marshall had watched these officers for years. He knew their strengths and weaknesses. He knew which ones could adapt and which could not. He knew which ones would rise to crisis and which would crumble under pressure. The knowledge he had accumulated over 3 decades of service would now determine who led the American army into battle. Marshall testified before Congress in April 1940 and laid out his philosophy with characteristic bluntness. Leadership in the field, he said, depends to an important extent on one's legs and stomach and nervous system. It depends on one's ability to withstand hardships and lack of sleep and still be disposed energetically and aggressively to command men, to dominate men on the battlefield. The generals he had inherited, Marshall believed, could not meet this standard. Most of them were too old to command troops in battle under the terrific pressure of modern war, he wrote. Their minds were set in outmoded patterns, and they could not change to meet the new conditions. This was not mere theory. Marshall had studied the German campaigns in Poland and France. He had seen how speed, aggression, and initiative at all levels of command had shattered larger forces that relied on methodical approaches. The Germans had introduced a new way of war. Their commanders made decisions in hours that would have taken traditional armies days. They exploited success ruthlessly, driving deep into enemy territory before defenders could react. The generals who would lead American soldiers against such an enemy needed to think and act differently than their predecessors. They needed to move fast, decide fast, and accept risk. They needed physical stamina to command from the front, rather than from comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines. They needed the moral courage to make hard decisions when lives hung in the balance. But removing senior officers from command was not a simple matter. The army had traditions stretching back to the Revolution. Officers had friends in Congress, connections in industry, classmates scattered throughout the service. Careers that spanned decades could not be ended without consequence. The political risks were enormous. Every general marshal pushed aside had former subordinates who would remember the slight. Every forced retirement created enemies who might undermine him later. The wives of senior officers formed a social network in Washington that could make or break reputations. Marshall was not merely reforming the army, he was disrupting a way of life. Marshall proceeded anyway. He had faced opposition before. Early in his career, he had contradicted General Pershing in a meeting and expected to be relieved. Instead, Pershing had promoted him. Marshall learned that honest counsel, delivered respectfully but firmly, earned more respect than sycophancy. He applied that lesson now. He began informally at first, using his authority as Chief of Staff to reassign officers to less critical positions, to pass them over for promotion, to encourage early retirement. When these measures proved insufficient, he sought legislative authority to remove officers directly. The mechanism he created became known as the Plucking Board, though its official name was the Removal Board. The Second Supplemental Appropriation Act of 1940 gave Marshall the authority he needed by eliminating the requirement that promotions below Brigadier General occur solely through seniority. This allowed him to promote younger officers over their seniors and to push aside those who could not meet the demands of modern command. The board itself consisted of 6 retired general officers, deliberately chosen so that serving officers would not be judging their potential rivals. Marshall asked his immediate predecessor as Chief of Staff, General Malin Craig, to come out of retirement and chair the board. Craig had served from 1935 to 1939 and was widely respected throughout the army. His presence lent legitimacy to the process. No one could accuse Marshall of settling personal scores when his own predecessor was making the decisions. Marshall's instructions to the board established the governing philosophy. The mission, he wrote, is not to weigh a long and successful career against a failure in 1940 or 1941. It is not the function of the board to determine how good a man he has been. Rather, it is to determine the worth and value of the individual to the army today. Critical times are upon us. The measure must be today's performance. Officers removed by the board received 1 year to retire, a more dignified exit than immediate dismissal, but an unmistakable end to their careers. The board's authority was sweeping. It was empowered to remove from line promotion any officer for reasons deemed good and sufficient. The documented removals tell part of the story. In the summer and fall of 1941 alone, the board removed 31 colonels, 117 lieutenant colonels, 31 majors, 16 captains, and 269 National Guard and reserve officers. The lieutenant colonels were the largest group because they represented the bottleneck of World War I veterans who had been waiting decades for advancement. In the 5 years before Marshall took command, only 37 officers total had been removed from the army, an average of fewer than 8 per year. Marshall increased the removal rate more than 5-fold. Ultimately, 500 colonels were forced into retirement. Marshall himself estimated that he pushed out at least 600 officers before the United States entered the war. The scale of the purge became clear during the Louisiana maneuvers of August and September 1941. These massive exercises, involving nearly 500,000 troops across a vast swathe of Louisiana and East Texas, served as Marshall's final examination for his officer corps. The maneuvers were the largest military exercises in American history to that point. They tested not just tactical skills, but leadership under conditions that approximated combat. Units maneuvered day and night. Communications were disrupted. Plans fell apart and had to be improvised. The fog of war, or at least a reasonable approximation of it, descended on commanders who had spent decades in the predictable routine of peacetime service. Marshall watched carefully to see which commanders could handle the stress, which could adapt to changing circumstances, which could lead men under conditions that approximated combat. He moved constantly between command posts, observing how generals reacted to setbacks, how they communicated with their staffs, how they maintained the morale of exhausted troops. Of the 42 generals who commanded a division, corps, or army during those exercises, historians estimate that only 11 would go on to hold combat commands during the war. The other 31 were pushed aside, reassigned, or retired. Marshall had seen what he needed to see. One incident during the maneuvers became legendary. George Patton, then commanding the 2nd Armored Division, was supposed to be contained by a defensive line. Instead, he led his tanks on a night march around the enemy flank, moving so fast that umpires could not keep up with him. At dawn, Patton's tanks burst into the headquarters of Lieutenant General Hughdrum, nominally capturing the commander of the opposing force. The maneuver was brilliant, aggressive, and exactly the kind of initiative Marshall wanted to see. Patton had proven he could move and think faster than his opponents. Drum had proven that he could not adapt when circumstances changed unexpectedly. Both lessons would influence Marshall's decisions about who would lead in combat. The men Marshall removed were not incompetent. Many had served honorably for decades. Some had distinguished records from the First World War. But Marshall applied a ruthless standard. Past achievement meant nothing if an officer could not perform today. A brilliant career was irrelevant if a man's best years were behind him. One confrontation illustrated Marshall's approach. A general at Fort Leavenworth was ordered to update the Army's training manuals to reflect the lessons of the German campaigns in Europe. He told Marshall the work would take 18 months. Marshall offered 3 months. The general refused. Marshall offered 4 months. The general said it was impossible, that such comprehensive revisions could not be completed in less than a year and a half. Marshall asked him to reconsider, warning him to be very careful about that answer. When the general insisted the timeline could not be shortened, Marshall's response was immediate. "I am sorry." "Then you are relieved." The incident revealed something essential about Marshall's leadership. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply stated the requirement and accepted no excuses. Officers who could not meet his standards were removed, regardless of their previous service or their connections. The manuals, incidentally, were completed in 4 months by other officers. Marshall showed the same coldness toward personal friends. One general, ordered to France on an important mission, explained that he could not depart quickly because his wife was away and household furniture remained unpacked. Marshall called him personally to confirm this was his position. When the general said it was, Marshall replied, "Well, my God, man, we are at war and you are a general. I am sorry too, but you will be retired tomorrow." The highest profile casualty of Marshall's reforms was Lieutenant General Hugh Drum, though his fate came through being passed over rather than formally removed. Drum had reached the rank of Major General in 1930 and held nearly every top position below Chief of Staff. He had been Chief of Staff for the First Army in France during the World War, where Douglas MacArthur claimed he had virtually run the army. By every measure of seniority and experience, Drum should have become Chief of Staff, but Drum had promoted his own cause so vigorously that he alienated President Franklin Roosevelt. He lobbied openly for the position, cultivated newspaper coverage, and made clear his expectation that the job was his due. When the appointment was made in 1939, Roosevelt passed over Drum and 32 other senior officers to select Marshall, who was 34th in overall Army seniority. Marshall had been outranked by 21 major generals and 11 brigadier generals. Drum never forgave the slight and never stopped maneuvering for high command. During the war, he was summoned to Washington expecting to receive command of American forces in Europe, based on a conversation with Roosevelt from 1939. Instead, Marshall offered him the position of Chief of Staff to Chiang Kai-shek in China. Drum objected strenuously. He said the mission was nebulous, uncertain, and indefinite. He complained about serving 3 masters, including Chiang, the British, and Washington. When Marshall said no large American forces would go to China, Drum remarked that he would be wasted in a minor post. Marshall concluded that Drum lacked enthusiasm for the assignment and recommended against sending him. Joseph Stilwell was selected instead on January 14, 1942. When Stilwell was asked if he would accept the difficult China command, his response was simple: "I will go where I am sent." Drum was relegated to commanding the Eastern Defense Command, essentially home defense duty on the American East Coast. He reached mandatory retirement age at 64 in September 1943. He received his second Distinguished Service Medal at a ceremony where Marshall himself read the citation, but he never received the combat command he had sought for decades. The irony is that Fort Drum in New York is named in his honor. No military installation bears Marshall's name. The removals made room for the officers Marshall believed could win the war, but identifying those officers required a different kind of talent, the ability to recognize potential that had not yet been proven, to see what men might become, rather than what they had already done. A legend grew up around Marshall's methods. People said he kept a little black book containing the names of promising officers he had observed throughout his career. The story was repeated so often that it became accepted as fact. Marshall's own biographer, Forrest Pogue, mentioned it in his work on page 95 of the second volume. But the little black book never existed. The George C. Marshall Foundation has confirmed that no such notebook was ever found among Marshall's papers. When Dr. Larry Bland, the editor of the papers of George Catlett Marshall, asked Pogue directly on 2 separate occasions whether Marshall kept such a book, Pogue confirmed that he did not. Pogue admitted that he had repeated the myth when it was presumed real, and said he was sorry he had included it in his writing because it gave the story authority it did not deserve. What Marshall actually possessed was an extraordinary memory. Throughout his career, he had observed officers at key vantage points. At Fort Benning, where he served as assistant commandant from 1927 to 1932, he had watched hundreds of officers teach, learn, and lead. In China, in Washington, and in various staff positions, he had noted who showed initiative and who waited for orders, who could think clearly under pressure and who froze, who could inspire men and who merely commanded them. The list of promising officers existed entirely in his mind. He could recall conversations from years earlier, impressions formed in passing, potential glimpsed in a single exercise or staff meeting. This mental catalogue, accumulated over decades, would determine who led American forces into battle. During his years at Fort Benning, approximately 150 future generals attended the infantry school, with about 50 serving on the faculty. Marshall watched them all. He assigned them challenging problems and observed how they responded. He noted who asked the right questions and who accepted easy answers. These officers became known as the Marshall Men, and their careers would accelerate dramatically once Marshall gained the power to promote them. The selection of Dwight Eisenhower demonstrated Marshall's methods in action. Their first meaningful contact came in 1930 when Marshall was impressed by a young major working on the American Battlefield Monuments Commission staff who had helped General John Pershing revise his memoirs. The work required tact, intelligence, and the ability to manage a difficult superior. Marshall noted these qualities and remembered the young officer's name. Marshall offered Eisenhower a position on the Fort Benning faculty. Eisenhower politely declined because he already had orders for a coveted general staff assignment in Washington. The refusal did not offend Marshall. If anything, it demonstrated that Eisenhower could make decisions and stick to them. Their paths crossed again at the Louisiana maneuvers in September 1941. Eisenhower was then a lieutenant colonel serving as chief of staff for Lieutenant General Walter Kruger's Third Army. His performance caught Marshall's attention. Eisenhower had helped plan operations that consistently outmaneuvered the opposing force. His staff work was meticulous but not rigid. When plans needed to change, he changed them. The pivotal moment came on December 14, 1941, exactly 1 week after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Marshall summoned Eisenhower to Washington. Eisenhower flew from Fort Sam Houston in Texas, arriving exhausted after delays and bad weather. It was the first time he had spoken to Marshall for more than 2 minutes. Marshall presented a grim overview of the situation in the Pacific. The Philippines, where Eisenhower had served 4 years under MacArthur, were under attack. The Pacific Fleet had been devastated at Pearl Harbor. Japanese forces were advancing across Southeast Asia. The strategic situation appeared desperate. Then Marshall posed a test. What should be our general line of action? Eisenhower asked for a few hours and a desk. Marshall provided both. Several hours later, Eisenhower returned with a memorandum that acknowledged the Philippines could not be saved, but argued they could not be abandoned either. The United States had to make every effort to support the defenders, even if the effort was ultimately futile, because abandoning them would destroy American credibility with allies throughout the Pacific. He recommended building up Australia as a base for Pacific operations. This analysis became the core Pacific strategy. More importantly, it demonstrated exactly what Marshall wanted to see. Eisenhower had not asked for more information. He had not requested a committee to study the problem. He had not hedged his conclusions with qualifications. He had analyzed the situation, reached a decision, and presented a clear recommendation. Marshall's response revealed his philosophy. Eisenhower, he said, The department is filled with able men who analyze their problems well, but feel always compelled to bring them to me for final solution. I must have assistants who will solve their own problems and tell me later what they have done. Eisenhower had passed the test. Marshall assigned him to the War Plans Division, overseeing the Philippines and Far East. By February 1942, just 2 months later, Eisenhower was chief of the entire War Plans Division. His subsequent rise was the fastest of any general in the Second World War. From lieutenant colonel in December 1941, he became a 5-star general of the Army by December 1944, a promotion that came just 4 days after Marshall himself received his 5th star. George Patton presented a different kind of challenge. Marshall had known Patton since the First World War and had renewed the friendship at Fort Myer in late 1938, when Patton commanded the 3rd Cavalry. The two men were a study in contrasts. Marshall was reserved, methodical, and self-effacing. Patton was flamboyant, impulsive, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. Marshall regarded Patton as the Allies' best fighting general, but recognized that he required management. Patton, Marshall observed, needs a break to slow him down because he is apt to coast at breakneck speed, propelled by his enthusiasm and exuberance. Catherine Marshall, the general's wife, once told Patton that he could not talk the way he did. "George, you say these outrageous things, and then you look at me to see if I am going to smile," she said. "A general cannot talk in any such wild way." At 54 years old, Patton fell into the category of officers who might have been pushed aside under Marshall's age standards. He survived the Plucking Board's review only because he demonstrated the energy and drive of a much younger man. His performance in the Louisiana maneuvers, where his armored division ran circles around the opposition, proved that age had not diminished his capabilities. Marshall elevated Patton from colonel in July 1938 to 4-star general by April 1945. The journey between those ranks was tumultuous. Patton's mouth got him into trouble repeatedly. His actions sometimes bordered on insubordination, but Marshall protected him because he recognized that Patton was irreplaceable. Twice during the war, Marshall intervened to save Patton's career. In Sicily, Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, an incident that became a scandal when reporters learned of it. Eisenhower, who commanded the Mediterranean theater, considered sending Patton home in disgrace. Marshall counseled patience. Patton was too valuable to lose. After the Knutsford affair in England, when Patton made impolitic remarks suggesting that the United States and Britain would rule the post-war world with no mention of the Soviet Union, Marshall again protected him. The incident nearly cost Patton his command on the eve of the Normandy invasion. Marshall's intervention kept him in place. Omar Bradley represented yet another path to high command. He had served as a tactics instructor at Fort Benning during Marshall's tenure as assistant commandant. The two men had worked closely together, and Marshall had observed Bradley's teaching methods, his treatment of students, and his approach to military problems. Marshall described Bradley as quiet, unassuming, capable, with sound common sense. These were not flashy qualities, but they were the qualities Marshall valued most. Bradley did not seek attention. He did not promote himself. He simply did his job with steady competence. Bradley later wrote that no man had a greater influence on him personally or professionally than George Marshall. The relationship shaped Bradley's entire career and his approach to command. Bradley rose from brigadier general in February 1941 to 4-star general and commander of the 12th Army Group, the largest American field command in history. More than 1,300,000 soldiers served under his command during the campaigns in France and Germany. He would later become the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a position that placed him at the pinnacle of the American military establishment. Joseph Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe for his sharp tongue and acid personality, impressed Marshall so deeply that Marshall held open the position of Chief of the Tactical Section at Fort Benning for a full year until Stilwell became available. Other officers wanted the job. Marshall waited for the man he wanted. Marshall called Stilwell possessed of a genius for instruction and one of the exceptionally brilliant and cultured men of the army. The description of Stilwell as cultured might have surprised those who knew only his crusty exterior, but Stilwell spoke Chinese fluently, had studied Chinese history and literature, and understood Asia better than almost any American officer of his generation. When Marshall needed someone to handle the impossible China assignment that Drum had rejected, Stilwell was his choice. The mission proved every bit as difficult as Drum had feared. Stilwell fought with Chiang Kai-shek, clashed with the British, and watched his forces suffer repeated defeats. But he never quit. He never asked to be relieved. He did exactly what Marshall had asked of him. The roster of commanders Marshall identified and elevated reads like a history of American victory in the Second World War. Mark Clark led the Fifth Army in Italy. Courtney Hodges commanded the First Army in Europe. Jacob Devers led the Sixth Army Group in the invasion of southern France. J. Lawton Collins became one of the most aggressive corps commanders in the European theatre. Lucian Truscott led divisions and corps in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and southern France. Matthew Ridgway commanded airborne forces in Normandy and later led the 18th Airborne Corps. Walter Kruger directed the 6th Army across the Pacific. These men led American forces from the beaches of North Africa to the heart of Germany, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the Philippines and beyond. They defeated two of the most formidable military powers in history simultaneously. The consequences of Marshall's reforms became clear when American forces were measured against armies that had not undergone similar transformation. France offered the most devastating contrast. When Germany attacked in May 1940, the French army possessed more tanks than the Wehrmacht. It had adequate manpower, with approximately 5 million men under arms. Its defensive fortifications along the Maginot Line were engineering marvels that represented the most sophisticated military construction of the age. On paper, France should have been able to resist the German onslaught, but French leadership was aged, rigid, and trapped in the patterns of the previous war. General Maurice Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, was 67 years old during the campaign. He had established his headquarters at the Château de Vincennes, a medieval fortress without modern communications equipment. The headquarters had no radio. Orders travelled by motorcycle courier, a method that belonged to 1914, not 1940. Gamelin had decreed in 1935 that the High Command was the sole arbiter for doctrine. All articles, lectures, and books by serving officers required approval before publication. This effectively stifled innovation and ensured that French military thinking remained frozen in the patterns of the First World War. Officers who questioned established doctrine risked their careers. When the Germans punched through the Ardennes forest, an area Gamelin had left defended by only 10 reserve divisions because he considered it impassable to armour, the French command structure collapsed. Gamelin sat in what observers called tragic immobility, unable to issue decisive orders as his armies disintegrated. The speed of the German advance overwhelmed a command system designed for the deliberate pace of trench warfare. His replacement, General Maxime Weygand, was 73 years old, even older than Gamelin. Weygand arrived on May 19th, 9 days after the German attack began, when the breakthrough was already complete. Within a week, he was displaying pessimism that could have been interpreted as defeatism. The battle was lost before he could influence it. France fell in 6 weeks. Approximately 60,000 French soldiers died between May and June of 1940. The cause was not lack of courage among the troops or shortage of equipment. French soldiers fought bravely in many engagements. French tanks were often superior to their German counterparts. The cause was leadership that could not adapt to the speed and violence of modern warfare. Britain fared only marginally better in the early years of the war. The British Officer Corps maintained a rigid class-based selection system in which 89% of officer candidates at the Royal Military College at Sandhurst in 1939 came from expensive private schools. The system produced capable administrators, but discouraged the kind of aggressive initiative that modern warfare demanded. British reforms came only after battlefield defeats forced change. The General Service Corps scheme, which attempted to broaden the base of officer recruitment, was not introduced until July 1942, nearly 3 years after the war began. By then, Britain had suffered disasters in France, North Africa, and the Far East. Germany, ironically, had a more merit-based officer evaluation system than either France or Britain. German officers were rated in 7 categories ranging from suitable for Wehrmacht, high command, to already unsuitable for current position. Junior officers could command battle groups over their seniors based on tactical necessity. This flexibility, combined with a doctrine that emphasized initiative at all levels, gave the German army decisive advantages in the early years of the war. But German flexibility had limits. Adolf Hitler increasingly interfered with military operations, overruling his generals based on intuition rather than analysis. Commanders who disagreed with the Führer risked their careers and sometimes their lives. The honest assessments that might have corrected German strategy were suppressed in favor of reports that told Hitler what he wanted to hear. Marshall's critics charged that he was destroying institutional memory, that he was throwing away decades of accumulated experience, that he was promoting untested men over proven leaders. Service newspapers accused him of getting rid of all the brains of the army. Marshall's response was characteristically dry. "I could not reply," he said, "that I was eliminating considerable arteriosclerosis." Congressional opposition centered on National Guard generals with political connections. The Guard was deeply intertwined with state politics. Guard generals often owed their positions to governors and legislators rather than military merit. When politicians questioned his efforts to replace Guard division leadership, Marshall's response was blunt. "I am not going to leave him in command of that division," he said of one politically connected general, "so I will put it to you this way. If he stays, I go. And if I stay, he goes." The politician backed down. Marshall's willingness to stake his position on personnel decisions gave him leverage that few chiefs of staff had possessed. When Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter passed along criticism from a friend in the Army Reserve, Marshall replied tartly, "Most of our senior officers on such duty are deadwood and should be eliminated from the service as rapidly as possible." He did not soften his views for friends of the powerful. The opposition never stopped Marshall because he possessed something his critics lacked: the absolute confidence of President Roosevelt. The president had selected Marshall over 33 more senior officers, precisely because he recognized in Marshall the moral courage to make hard decisions. Roosevelt backed his chief of staff consistently, even when the political costs were significant. Marshall's selections were not infallible. He made mistakes, and he learned from them. He was especially fond of Lloyd Fredendall, calling him one of the best and remarking that you could see determination all over his face. Fredendall commanded the largest task force in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in November 1942. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Fredendall proved disastrous. His command post was located 70 miles behind the front lines, in an elaborate underground bunker that his engineers had spent weeks constructing while combat units needed their skills elsewhere. He issued confusing orders using a personal code that his subordinates could not understand. When German forces attacked, American units were positioned poorly and coordinated worse. The result was the worst American defeat of the European War. More than 6,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were staggering. German commanders who had wondered whether American troops could fight concluded that their doubts had been confirmed. Both Marshall and Eisenhower came to regret the Fredendall selection, but the system Marshall had created allowed for correction. Fredendall was relieved and replaced by Patton, who transformed the defeated corps into a fighting force within weeks. The ability to remove failing commanders without destroying their careers or creating political crises was itself a product of Marshall's reforms. Fredendall was not disgraced. He was sent back to the United States to train new troops, a position where his organizational skills could be useful without the pressures of combat command. His experience, even failed experience, was not wasted. During the war, 16 Army division commanders were relieved for cause, along with at least 5 corps commanders. Critically, the system permitted second chances. At least 5 generals who were relieved of combat command were later given another division to lead. Orlando Ward commanded the 20th Armored Division in 1945 after being relieved earlier in the war. Terry Allen led the 104th Infantry Division through the end of the war after his removal from the 1st Infantry Division. This flexibility distinguished the American approach from both the German and the British systems. German commanders who failed were often shot or imprisoned. British commanders who failed were rarely given second opportunities. The American system treated failure as information rather than disgrace, allowing the army to learn from mistakes rather than simply punish them. The transformation Marshall achieved can be measured in numbers. When he took command in September 1939, the army had fewer than 190,000 soldiers organized into 6 divisions, with only 4 in the continental United States, 1 in Hawaii, and 1 in the Philippines. By the end of 1940, the number had grown to 269,000. By the end of 1941, it exceeded 1,400,000. By 1943, nearly 7 million. At its peak in March 1945, the United States Army numbered more than 8 million soldiers, organized into 91 divisions. This expansion required a corresponding increase in officers. Men who had been lieutenants in 1940 were colonels by 1944. The bottleneck that had strangled careers for 2 decades was shattered by the demands of global war. The young officers Marshall had identified and protected now led divisions and corps into battle. The army that stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, bore no resemblance to the force Marshall had inherited 5 years earlier. American soldiers crossed the English Channel in landing craft designed and built in American shipyards. They were supported by aircraft manufactured in American factories. They carried weapons produced by an industrial mobilization that had transformed the American economy. But equipment alone did not win battles. The men who led those soldiers had been selected, trained, and tested by the system Marshall created. They had survived the plucking board. They had proven themselves in maneuvers and in combat. They were the best officers the American military could produce, and they led from the front. Winston Churchill called Marshall the true organizer of victory and the noblest Roman of them all. Eisenhower declared that our army and people have never been so indebted to any soldier. Harry Truman said simply that millions of Americans gave their country outstanding service. George C. Marshall gave it victory. Time magazine named Marshall Man of the Year twice, in 1943 and 1947. He became the first and only career soldier to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, awarded in 1953 for the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after the war. He served as both Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, the only person in American history to hold both positions. The officers Marshall removed faded into obscurity. Their names appear in no histories of the war. Their contributions, whatever they might have been, remained unmade. Some accepted their fate with dignity, understanding that the mission was greater than any individual career. Others harbored resentment for the rest of their lives, never accepting that their time had passed. The officers Marshall promoted became legends. Eisenhower served 2 terms as President of the United States. Bradley became a 5-star general and the most respected military figure of the post-war era. Patton died in a car accident just months after the German surrender, but his name became synonymous with aggressive leadership. The Marshall Men shaped American military doctrine and defense policy for a generation after the war ended. Marshall himself sought no glory. When Roosevelt died in April 1945 and Harry Truman became president, many assumed Marshall would receive command of the invasion of Japan or some other prestigious assignment. Instead, Marshall remained in Washington, coordinating the global war effort from his desk. When Eisenhower was selected to command the Normandy invasion, a position Marshall had wanted, he accepted the decision without complaint. Truman offered Marshall the chance to become the military governor of Germany after the war. Marshall declined. He had seen enough of war. He wanted to go home to his garden in Leesburg, Virginia, and spend time with his wife Catherine. But retirement proved impossible. Truman needed him in China as a special envoy, then as Secretary of State, then as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War. Marshall served until his health failed, always answering when his country called. The lesson of Marshall's officer purge extends beyond military affairs. Organizations of all kinds faced the same challenge he confronted. How do you remove people who have done nothing wrong except grow old in their positions? How do you make room for new talent when existing leaders have earned their places through years of faithful service? How do you balance loyalty to individuals against responsibility to the institution? Marshall's answer was uncompromising. The measure must be today's performance. Past achievements, personal friendships, political connections, none of these could be allowed to outweigh current capability. The mission was too important. The stakes were too high. Men would die if leaders could not lead. Marshall stated his philosophy in words that deserve to be remembered. The truly great leader overcomes all difficulties, he said. Campaigns and battles are nothing but a long series of difficulties to be overcome. The lack of equipment, the lack of food, the lack of this or that are only excuses. The real leader displays his quality in his triumphs over adversity, however great it may be. He had another saying that captured his approach to selecting leaders. If leadership depends purely on seniority, he said, you are defeated before you start. You give a good leader very little, and he will succeed. You give mediocrity a great deal and they will fail. This principle, demanding excellence, accepting no excuses, measuring leaders by results, transformed an army ranked 19th in the world into the force that defeated Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. It remains Marshall's enduring legacy. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves to be remembered. And we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans the globe, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.
Even at 243 years of age, by comparison, the United States is still a fairly young country. But despite its relative infancy, America seems to have been fighting in one war or another since it declared independence from Britain in 1776. But none of the wars over the last 2.5 centuries have left a scar on American history quite like the Civil War. By the time the Confederate South surrendered to the Union North, it's estimated that over 600,000 men, an incredible 2% of the country's population at that time, were left dead. Countless films and books have been written about the Civil War. Maybe because the war was so close to home, on American soil, there is an entire culture that exists to preserve its history. Every year, Civil War battle reenactments take place on the same fields where the war was originally fought. The legacy of the men who fought is an enduring heritage for many families who continue to pass down the story of their ancestors' heroism or what they suffered. In short, there is no end to the amount of Civil War stories you can read about. But there is an aspect of the Civil War that remains widely unheard of: the paranormal legends and encounters that came out of it. From Gettysburg, Shiloh, Antietam, and many others, the battlefields where thousands of men shed their blood are notorious for unusual activity. Ghost stories are one thing. This story is something entirely different. It is said that during the Battle of Chickamauga in the state of Georgia, the intense fighting and bloodshed attracted something sinister. The fact is, nobody is really sure what to call it, but it's been seen by park rangers, visitors, and locals driving through the area at night, who then even wrecked their cars in terror. Some say it's humanoid, wearing clothing like a cape or duster coat, with wild, waist-length hair. Others have called it a beast-like creature with fangs. There are many theories about what it might be, but there was one defining feature that seems to connect all of these stories: the color of its eyes. From the stranger side of American Civil War history, this is the story of the entity known as Old Green Eyes. The mist which hangs before you
offers you a choice:
to pass through
or to escape.
Beyond it are
Stories
which defy
the explanation
and fly in the face.
of what we know to be real,
It is a void of both
reality
and impossibility.
of both fact
and superstition.
You alone are left to discern
what to believe as you pass through what we call the fog of war.
Thanks to BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. Picture this: you've got a steady job, another 12 to 15 years of career potential, everything is going great. And then you suddenly injure your spine. And now you've got chronic pain, you're on narcotic pain meds every day, you're relegated to administrative desk work, and your bosses now look at you as more of a liability than an asset. Everyone you work with is moving on with their careers, and you're just stuck in one place. And then the organization decides that you aren't fit to even work for them anymore and terminates your employment. You've still got a family to provide for, but now you have no job, no prospects, and you have no idea what you're going to do next. That's pretty much how my Marine Corps career ended in 2017. And for a long time, I avoided talking to a therapist because I thought that I could just figure everything out on my own. I didn't need help. But I was wrong. I was bitter, I was angry, and I really needed someone to listen to me and then constructively help me see things from another perspective. BetterHelp makes therapy simple. A therapist can give you tools to make positive changes and guide you through life's challenges. Getting started is easy. Fill out a questionnaire, get matched in a couple of days, and if it's not the right fit, you can switch at any time at no extra cost. With over 7,000 reviews and a 4.3 rating on Trustpilot, BetterHelp is a platform you can trust. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/wartime stories to get 10% off your first month. Asking for help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. All right, back to our story. When the sun rose over Chickamauga on September 21st, 1863, the once picturesque landscape of rolling hills and forests was now one of complete devastation. The Union Army had just captured a vital railway hub in Chattanooga, Tennessee, just over the nearby state line. They then launched an offensive into northern Georgia. On September 19th, they were met by the defending Confederates near the small town of Chickamauga. What followed over the next 48 hours was an appalling bloodbath, even by the standards of the already brutal Civil War. By the time the Northern troops retreated, leaving the Confederates victorious, over 36,000 men lay dead or wounded on the battlefield. As the war moved on, the citizens of the nearby town, as was so often the case, flocked to the battlefield in an effort to aid the wounded and, more strenuously, bury the tens of thousands of corpses. Looking to help in any way they could, the nuns of a nearby convent volunteered their services. The sisters offered spiritual support and even pitched in with carrying the bodies and helping to dig the graves. The whole ordeal was a lot to take in, It was unlike anything these women or the local townspeople had ever experienced. The disturbing scene was especially hard on one of the sisters. She had gone from living a quiet, sheltered life of prayer and religious study, and now, this.
Lord, I know we are called to be patient, but when you said there will come a time when you will wipe every tear from our eyes, and there will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain. Oh, Father, if only that could be today. These boys shouldn't be fighting a war. That one couldn't have been a day over 13. Hello? Is someone there? Do you need help?
While attending to the bodies of the men, the young nun wanted to pause for a moment to rest. She excused herself from the group and walked away to find a more secluded, wooded area, possibly to pray, her emotions being somewhat overwrought. But as she tried to collect herself, she heard something moving in the forest a short distance away. This woman is the first known witness to the thing that has stalked the area since the battle concluded, so perhaps she can be credited with the birth of the legend. But whatever it was she saw, it was nothing short of horrifying. Hunched over the body of a dead soldier was what she described as a demonic-looking creature. What terrified her even more was when she realized it was eating the corpse, tearing pieces of flesh away with a mouth full of sharp-looking teeth. Thinking at first it might be some kind of wild animal, she knew she wasn't safe and tried backing away from it. But then she stepped on a branch, and the noise caused the creature to look up at her. That's when she saw its eyes. They were bright green, and in the shadow of the trees, it looked like they were glowing. She had never seen a demon, but this sure as hell looked like one. She instinctively grabbed the crucifix she wore around her neck and began calling out to God, commanding the creature to leave. To her astonishment, it actually seemed to work. The creature, still staring at her with its massive green eyes, suddenly screamed and then faded into nothing. It would be the last time she saw the creature, but far from the last time it was seen.
Come on, you piece of junk. Ah! Ugh. Great. Brother, you need to start saving for a new truck. This old bucket of bolts just ain't it. Huh. What kind of Scooby-Doo contraption are they driving? Green headlights? Wild.
This next story is often referenced in articles and message boards discussing the legend of Old Green Eyes. It centers around an anonymous young man. We'll call him Mark. Sometime in the 1970s or 80s, Mark was heading to see his new girlfriend just over the Georgia state line. His night already wasn't going well. Right as he finished work, his car broke down, and it was about to rain. Not wanting to miss his date, he talked his older brother into lending him a beat-up old pickup. Since he was now running late, he decided to take a shortcut down Lafayette Road, which ran right through Chickamauga. Now driving with thick woods on both sides, the heavy rain had finally stopped, but a thick fog had rolled in across the old battlefield. As he drove the old truck through the fog, he then saw something weird coming towards him in the other lane. At first, he thought it was just another car's headlights, but then he noticed they were green. Mark thought it was odd, He'd never seen green headlights before. He figured maybe they were some kind of special bulb. As Mark got closer, he saw the green lights were very bright. Then they started moving back and forth on the road ahead. Still thinking they were headlights, Mark tapped his horn, wanting to tell this crazy nut to watch out. But that just made things worse. At the sound of his horn, the lights seemed to swerve right into his lane, lining up his truck for a head-on collision. Mark started to think this driver must be drunk, so he leaned even harder onto his horn. The lights were approaching fast. The collision was going to happen at any second. Mark slammed on his brakes and tried to swerve out of the way. As the old truck careened off the side of the road, Mark suddenly saw that the green lights weren't attached to another vehicle. They weren't attached to anything at all. It was just two large, green, floating orbs of light darting back and forth across the road.
Oh, my head. Oh, man. John's gonna kill me. What is that?
When Mark came to after the crash, the first thing he saw was that his brother's truck was completely wrecked. The front end was now firmly wrapped around a large tree stump. Luckily, from what he could feel, the only injury Mark seemed to have was a bump on his head, but that might just have been his adrenaline. Unfortunately, the headlights were now smashed, and he couldn't see. Everything around him on Lafayette Road was pitch black, except for a faint green glow. Turning his head, the next thing Mark saw were the orbs, like two glowing green eyes hovering in the fog over the road. Mark began to feel an inexplicable sense of terror as he watched them. Then, they suddenly faded away. Now even darker than it was, Mark felt another jolt of fear. Something was moving around just outside the truck. Turning to look toward the trees, Mark spotted a figure moving through the fog, only dimly lit by the moon overhead, enough for him to make out an outline. It looked like a man with long dark hair hanging all the way down to his waist. As he was staring at it, he then heard it. The figure started moaning. As it paced around the truck, clearly watching him, it was making these low, ominous, somber noises. Mark had no idea what was happening, but it was sending chills down his spine. And then, as quickly as the green orbs had vanished, the figure seemed to disappear into the surrounding darkness. It was quiet. Mark waited a while to see if anything else would happen, before then trying to open the door to get out.
Oh, shit!
In an instant, the creature had pounced on the hood of Mark's truck. Now sitting just feet from him behind the cracked windshield, Mark could see it. It wasn't human. The creature had long, dirty hair, a wide mouth full of razor-sharp fangs, and two glowing green eyes. Mark said at that point he wanted to scream, but for some reason he couldn't. If Mark's story couldn't get any more strange, it does now. According to Mark, staring at the creature's eyes somehow lulled him into a hypnotic trance. Everything around them, the road, the trees, seemed to melt away. When the vision came into focus, Mark was shocked to see bodies lying around him. The ground was covered with the bodies of men in dark navy and gray uniforms. In the distance, he heard the sounds of explosions, cracking sounds. The ground was scorched. The air had an odor to it Mark couldn't describe. He could hear men screaming in pain, moaning. The blaring sound of a car horn was what snapped Mark out of his vision. A park ranger patrol vehicle was now approaching Mark's wrecked truck. The last thing Mark remembered seeing was the creature leaping off of the hood and vanishing into the fog. Two rangers jumped out of their truck and approached him. As they helped him out of the truck, Mark, visibly shaken, could only ask the rangers if they had seen the green-eyed creature that was just there. The rangers exchanged glances. Clearly, they thought this poor kid was probably suffering from a concussion. The rangers tried to assure him nothing was there, but Mark was adamant, so much to the point that they decided to at least search the area just to humor him. They found nothing. But these two men wouldn't be the last of the park rangers tangled up in the story of Old Green Eyes.
Oh, man, I don't know if I'll ever understand these living history nerds.
Yeah? Why's that?
Well, these Civil War reenactment people running around in wool uniforms in this heat, pretending to shoot at each other. I could think of a few better ways to spend a weekend. I mean, you were in the Army, right, Ed? What would you rather do? Spend your Saturday night with a cold beer, your girl, or, sweating your ass off playing war during a Georgia summer?
Well, when you put it like that, I guess the answer's pretty easy, but I didn't have a choice when I was in. And for these guys, it's more than playing pretend. It's about keeping history alive, Like stepping back in time to relive the experience those soldiers had.
Well, call me crazy, but I happen to appreciate our modern comforts, like air conditioning.
Yeah, I guess you have a point there.
Whoa, who is this guy?
Huh, one of the, reenactors?
Wandering around in the dark at 4 a.m.? I knew these guys were kooky.
Dave?
What's that, Ed?
Something ain't right about that guy.
The story of the young man who got run off the road by Old Green Eyes is certainly the most intense encounter next to the nuns. But the encounter that seems to have introduced this creature to the wider paranormal world is the one reported by a man named Edward Tinney during a 1981 interview with a local newspaper. Before becoming a park ranger, Edward was an Army paratrooper, serving with the 11th Airborne Division through both World War II and the Korean War. With his military career behind him, Edward moved into the education field, where he worked as a teacher and school principal. He was originally from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and had a great love for history. Edward eventually became a park ranger, and later, the chief historian of the Chickamauga Battlefield Park. The incident took place a few years prior, in 1976. Edward and a fellow park ranger were out on the battlefield conducting a late-night patrol. There was some kind of living history event going on in the park, and the two men were making their way out to the reenactors' encampment to do their routine inspections, making sure the area was being kept clean and everything was in order. According to Edward, it was about 4 a.m. when something happened. As they walked along a stretch of empty road towards an intersection, they were approached by a tall, imposing figure of an unknown man. The two rangers weren't sure why, but something about the stranger immediately put them on edge. The man approaching on the road ahead of them appeared taller than the average man. It looked like he had stringy black hair that fell well past his shoulders, and it looked like he was wearing an old black riding coat. What really freaked the park rangers out was how aggressively he was walking towards them. The closer he got, the more tense they felt about meeting him. Hoping to avoid a confrontation, the rangers crossed to the other side of the road to give this stranger plenty of room to pass by them. He did just that, walking by them at a fast pace. But as he did so, Edward glanced over and caught a look at his face.
When it passed me, I could see its hair was long, like a woman's. The eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were glaring, almost greenish orange in color, flashing like some sort of wild animal. The teeth were long and pointed like fangs. I didn't know whether to run or scream or what. Then the headlights of an approaching car came blazing through the fog, and this thing disappeared right in front of me. Wherever there has been great suffering, people were always seeing strange things.
If they have been told for the last 150 years, it really is no surprise that stories about old green eyes have changed. A children's game of telephone is enough to prove that even in a couple of minutes, people tend to add and subtract from the original story, either because they can't remember the original or felt like making it more exciting. As is, the creature's exact appearance and purpose vary from one story to the next. For the people that do put stock in the stories about old green eyes, some speculate that the creature is a guardian of the battlefield, meant to frighten people away from the area for some reason. Others claim his roots go back much further, linking him to the spirits of ancient native tribes who lived on the land even before the Cherokee. However, because of the variations, it's possible that, because old green eyes became something of a local legend, some of the encounter stories are simply cases of misidentification. In the search for answers about old green eyes, there is an encounter that took place on Chickamauga that mentions something similar. It can be found in the 1953 book, The Official History of Catoosa County, written by Susie Blaylock McDaniel. It's the account of a man named Jim Carlock. Jim's story takes place just a decade after the nuns' harrowing experience. The people of Chickamauga may have already forgotten about her story after all that time, but in the summer of 1876, they would start hearing rumors that there was still something strange going on around the old battlefield.
Oh, God. Why do I let you talk me into these things?
It was for a good cause. You have to throw a few back for old Georgie on the Centennial, Jimbo.
I always say it, don't I? Whiskey don't agree with me. Never has and never will. I could feel it burning a hole in my gut right now.
Now, that there's just you finally discovering your manhood is all.
Oh, shut up. I'm starting to think you're a bad influence on me. You know that?
What, me? A bad influence? I'd like to think I bring out the best in you, Jimbo.
I think my wife would have something to say about
Hold on.
What's wrong?
You see that down yonder on the road? It's making its way towards us.
Oh, yes, I do. What in blue blazes is that? Is that a person?
You ever seen a person that tall before?
It was July 4th, 1876, and the United States was celebrating its centennial, its 100th birthday. Jim Carlock and his friends, like millions of other Americans, had been celebrating and partying hard into the night. After enjoying the centennial festivities up in Chattanooga, Jim and his buddies, tired and probably a little bit drunk, made their way back home on horseback. The route took them right across the old Chickamauga battlefield. Riding on horseback, Jim was riding up front with a good friend he identified as Mr. Shields. Together, the two of them led the way down a winding dirt road, followed closely by a wagon that was filled with the more drunken men who couldn't be trusted to stay on their horses, some of their more badly inebriated friends. As they rode through the battlefield, Jim and Mr. Shields noticed something taking shape ahead of them on the road. In the dim moonlight, they could see a figure slowly moving toward them. At first, it didn't seem like anything to worry about, but the longer they watched, the more uneasy they felt. Jim said the figure was at least 10 feet tall, with wild, white, frizzy hair. When they tried to talk to it, there was no response, and things got tense. Mr. Shields must have gotten scared because he rushed up to the figure and started hitting and kicking it. During the attack, the tall figure let out a high, baby-like cry, begging to be left alone, and then ran off into the darkness. The idea of kicking and hitting a spectral being and sending it off crying seems a bit odd, to say the least. But Jim's retelling of the story gave no indication that it was supposed to be funny. Even though it was hard to see, Jim said he was sure they had seen something supernatural, the ghost of a black washerwoman, somehow tied to the battle that had happened 13 years earlier. No mention of green eyes was made by Jim, according to Susie McDaniel's book. But it's possible stories like this are how legends begin, with details then being added over the following years of retellings. At the time, Jim was adamant that they saw what appeared to be a 10-foot-tall ghost of a black washerwoman, but it was dark, and given that they were coming back from July 4th festivities, it stands to reason that Jim and his buddies were more drunk than they let on. Honestly, it sounds like they very likely just assaulted a very real, very innocent, and probably very confused black woman carrying a laundry basket over her head on a late-night errand. Jim's supernatural encounter and its correlation to the old Green Eyes legend is enough to make us look more closely at the other stories about the creature. First, there is the story of the young man getting run off the road by old Green Eyes. Very vivid, and a story that has you on the edge of your seat. But after some digging, it is likely a work of fiction, a short story written by author Craig Dominey for the Moonlit Road website. Written from the point of view of someone recalling the encounter as a memory, it seems like people sharing it online have either knowingly or unknowingly started passing it off as a true story. The animalistic depictions of old Green Eyes in this story, as well as the nuns, are often repeated as known descriptions by anyone writing about the creature. Then we have the story of Edward Tinney, the former soldier and then park ranger/historian. Skeptics of Edward's encounter point out that the Chickamauga Battlefield Park was struggling to attract visitors in the late 1970s and early 80s. After Edward was interviewed, some dismissed his story as an obvious attempt to generate renewed interest in the park, to attract more tourists who had an interest in paranormal legends. That sort of thing has long been a popular draw for other battlefields, like Gettysburg. Only Edwards knows what really happened that night. But it's hard to miss that each of the three most well-known old Green Eyes encounters have a similar story structure. A dark, foggy night, someone making their way down an empty road, and then they are approached by a horrible creature, which turns out to be old Green Eyes. Many urban legends share this kind of symmetry, with each new version seeming to build on previous ones while unfolding in different locations and periods, each ending in its own unique way. Edward Tinney passed away in 2010. Without being able to ask him about it ourselves, there isn't much else to go on, aside from the interview he gave in 1981 and a short segment aired on a local Chattanooga news broadcast in 1999. Whatever the truth is behind the legend of old Green Eyes, there is still something sinister about the old battlefield at Chickamauga. The depiction of war painted by the men who witnessed the carnage at Chickamauga is arguably more unsettling than any ghost encounter. Confederate soldier Larkin Poe wrote in his journal about what he saw riding through the field after the battle had ended.
The moon was far down the west and cast a ghostly light over the woods and fields. The stillness of the night was unbroken, except for the sound of my horse's hooves and the hoot of some solitary owl. I'd seen an old house near Jay's Mill, filled with wounded and suffering men, and I'd hardly started till I began to see dead soldiers, yet unburied, lying in and near the road. I rode on, turning my horse first to the right, then to the left, to avoid the thick-strewn bodies. In places, I saw where great trees had been splintered by shells and riddled by bullets. Just before reaching the Brotherton house, I came upon a scene of death and destruction noteworthy. Even on that terrible field, I saw a piece of artillery, evidently a Federal piece, which had been knocked from the wheels by a direct hit from our guns. And apparently, most of all the horses and men belonging to the gun had perished there, for their bodies lay in grotesque heaps around their piece.
Whether spirit, monster, hallucination, or whatever it might be prowling the blood-soaked grounds of Chickamauga, there really is no need to justify the existence of something like Old Green Eyes. Many people have claimed to see it, and maybe they have. Even if it is just a legend, something meant to instill a feeling of dread to anyone who visits the battlefield, nobody denies that the Battle of Chickamauga happened. It's enough that Old Green Eyes exists just to remind us of the unspeakable horror of what did happen there all those years ago.
Hey guys, thanks for sticking around for the after action here and the credits. Old Green Eyes is one of those interesting creatures that seems to blur the line between what we would normally be talking about, like a cryptid, some kind of physical being, and more of a spirit. By definition, I think that makes it what somebody would call a ghoul, which I looked up the definition. It's a demon-like being or monstrous humanoid, which is often associated with graveyards and the consumption of human flesh. That actually more or less matches the descriptions of skinwalkers, doesn't it? So it again makes me wonder if across different cultures, these entities are really all the same thing, but given different names. As mentioned in the episode, some have suggested Old Green Eyes goes way back before native legends and is related to the native people as sort of a protective spirit over the land or over a gravesite, something. I don't know how people would have known this or theorized this, but they say it could date back around 5,000 years before Common Era. So 3,500 BCE, dating back to the time period associated with the ancient North American natives known as mound builders. If we were looking for more of a conventional explanation for Old Green Eyes, the idea that there is a large black panther or puma, maybe according to the research I read, more likely a black jaguar from Central South America, this large black cat with reflective green eyes prowling the forests of Georgia, that wouldn't be too far-fetched. There have been quite a few reports of large black cats in the UK, for instance, that were long dismissed as exaggerated reports of smaller cats or cases of mistaken identity. And these sightings created all kinds of legends. It was covered on bedtime stories about mysterious black cats across the UK, kind of a cryptid sort of thing. But then in 2023, after another Black Panther sighting was reported, there was a dead sheep involved, and the carcass was apparently swabbed and tested for DNA traces of the predator, and sure enough, it was confirmed that a cat belonging to the panther family had been eating the sheep. None of that would account for the human descriptions given to Old Green Eyes, though, to say that it was an animal. So the jury is still out. Spiritual entities with glowing eyes are seen just as frequently in North America. Actually, scratch that, they are seen far more often than I have ever heard stories about large black cats. And we will have many more stories like that to come. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching, for subscribing, liking, sharing the videos, the merchandise, anything and everything you guys do that helps support the channel. We here on the Wartime Stories team are extremely grateful for your incredible support. As always, a huge shout out to both our Patreon and YouTube channel supporters. May God be with each and every one of you, no matter what you are dealing with. And I will see you in the next episode.